Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. During this 4-episode series, I'll be speaking with Sarah Shippey Copeland and Lauren Magnuson. Sarah is Director of Desks and Patron Experience at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and Lauren is Head of Collections, Delivery, and Access at California State University, San Marcos. This series is brought to you by Taylor & Francis. Now, pay attention to those job titles because they're not just important on their own, they're key to our discussion, which focuses on how Sarah and Lauren and their libraries are altering operations to safely maintain services during the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll hear about what they did, how they did it, what worked and what didn't, and how they adjusted along the way. In this second episode, Sarah and Lauren talk about what's arguably more difficult than the planning phase, implementation. All right, so let's move into going from planning and move into implementation. And Sarah, I just want to stick with you for this question. Like you said in the last episode, you were there's a task force that created a report, an action plan that was basically handed off to all of the unit heads. And it was up to you to basically devise the implementation plan for that report, and during which you needed to interpret some fairly broad recommendations. And I'm wondering if you can sort of describe how you did that and what you focused on. For example, a big part of that was redesigning services for a consolidated desk model, right?
Yes, that's correct. That was probably one of the biggest changes, was moving from a 2-desk service model to a single desk service model. And I do want to back it up for just a second, though, to talk about a couple of guiding principles that I thought were really helpful.
Great.
So our dean gave us a heuristic for guiding our decision making, and this was handed out library-wide. This wasn't just for our department. And I found it really helpful as we thought through how to make services available. And so it's got 4 parts. And she calls it the 4 S's. Keep it the same, keep changes simple, keep changes similar, and keep changes student-friendly. And so, basically, if you can't keep it the same, then try to keep it simple and so on, right? And that was a really helpful guide for us. And then in terms of our actual approach, like how we tackled this big project, because by the time, we had about a month to get this all together. And so that's not very long to build it from the ground up. So we decided to figure out our staffing model first. And this is because we're working on much reduced staffing hours. We have had part-timers on our team in the past, and they are no longer continuing with us during the pandemic. And then we've also had a much bigger student assistant team in the past than we have right now. We're limited to 1 student per hour for the whole department, which is very different than how we're used to running. And so with those things in mind, we needed to figure out how we were actually going to staff our service point. And we ended up settling on a rotating cohort model, which I'd be happy to talk about later if you all would like to hear more about that. And then after that, we devised a list of services that we had to be able to fulfill as part of our core operations, and divided that list into things that could be handled remotely and things that were building specific. So for example, we use the student information system to place holds on student accounts. And that is something that could be handled remotely. Whereas checking out items that people want or pulling them from the stacks or that type of thing has to be handled on site. And so we divided things in those 2 categories. And then we also identified items that would make good tasks for our student assistants because they are not working at the desk the way they have in the past. They are sort of our side support, as it were. So they do kind of background work, but are not at the desk. So that was our overall approach to the process.
Okay, excellent. And then Lauren, so your library, from a circulation perspective, as you mentioned earlier, seemed to be in a very good position already, especially with respect to digital resources. Um, and in fact, it sounds like the pandemic had this effect of actually helping faculty realize just how many resources were available to them. And then in the meantime, you spent, as you described it, an enormous amount of money on direct requests for materials. So, I mean, it's sounding like you guys just whatever anybody wanted within reason. Um, your staff went ahead and got it for them. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you were able to leverage that dynamic um, also into the CARES funding, at least for the short term.
Sure. So at Cal State San Marcos, we've been really fortunate that even pre-pandemic, so we've had a history of these amazing interlibrary loan reserves and media library services that faculty and students had already relied on really heavily for course instruction for completing coursework. So library collections and resources were already really integrated into instruction before the pandemic, but the lack of access to the physical building at the start of the pandemic I think really upended some assumptions about how users were accessing the materials. And really, it showed how much users rely on physical materials like the physical reserves desk, because there are so many things the library cannot license electronically, like from the major textbook publishers, that we provided physical copies through reserves. And I think faculty realized at that point, too, how many students were not buying their textbooks that were assigned. They were
Right.
accessing them through the physical reserves desk, and we had no way to digitally provide that access because those publishers don't sell ebooks to libraries. So there's been this kind of collective realization about, for one thing, like how user friendly are those textbooks that faculty were assigning, right? And like, is there maybe another way to do that? And library collections, of course, we have been building these ebook collections for many years, really for this kind of scenario where maybe a faculty member could use some other library collections materials that are available digitally instead of maybe those traditional course materials. So we've definitely seen that realization of how the library's resources and the services that we provide are so deeply tied into campus-wide functioning. And so we've tracked from the beginning, and we were doing this before with reserves, where every book that we bought for reserves that we knew was for a specific class, we've put the course information into the records that we would set up in Alma. So we knew what courses we bought things for.
Mm-hmm.
So we were able to basically tie back every single purchase that we've made from the basically the beginning of the campus, the library's physical closure. We've tied that to every course that we've bought those things for. We did acquire some electronic resources that were specifically for some classes that were trying to engage students virtually, science classes especially that were having some trouble engaging students with some of the lab stuff that they were expected to complete virtually. So we tracked everything that we purchased, and then we kind of packaged that up into a request to our campus, the people who are going to make those decisions about funding, and we're able to say, for virtual instructions for specific classes to engage students directly, these are the resources that we have provided. This is what we spent every dollar on. This is even to the title list level. You can look at every single thing that we've bought. We've coded those things in such a way that we can kind of pull them up really quickly, everything that we
Mm-hmm.
purchased. So we're able to point to exactly what we're buying and how it's tied to the delivery of virtual instruction and student success. And so campus did agree to help reimburse us for some of those costs, even though the money itself may not actually be from CARES. The CARES grant itself, it's this campus-wide kind of realization that in a virtual learning environment, the library's resources are actually really key to helping faculty engage students and making sure that students can actually complete their coursework. And that's something that I'm not sure how well, especially outside of the library, a lot of the key people on campus would have known that or been able to describe how that was being used. So that's actually been, I think, in the chaos of everything, somewhat of a good outcome to just have more people realize how essential these resources are to teaching and learning on campus.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned the textbooks, and I wanted to touch on that again. And um, there was some fortunate timing, I think, involved with your plan. You actually the library took over the textbook affordability initiatives from Campus IT, right? And I'm wondering how that also played into the plans.
Great. So in January of 2020, so before COVID affected the campus in any way, it was decided that at the end of the fiscal year in June 2020, that the library would take over this textbook affordability program that had been running on campus since 2013, that Campus IT had been running.
Right.
And pre-COVID, we were already seeing how many of the courses, and we were involved in the project, even though it was a Campus IT project, but we had been working with the kind of leadership of that project to report what classes had become affordable or free, basically for students with low cost materials. And we were already seeing before the pandemic that so many of the classes that we were reporting as these affordable classes were becoming affordable because they were using library resources to replace traditional textbooks. And there's sort of two things that kind of fed into this whole shift to the library as the textbook affordability kind of center on campus. And one of them is that we have a reading list software that embeds into the learning management system, and that's called Legato. It's an Ex Libris system, and that allows faculty and the library as well to sort of help faculty build these lists of library materials that are embedded directly into their course shell in their Moodle is what we use for that. And students can see all of these readings, and they're all these freely available resources or ebooks, and they're sort of available at a glance, easy for students to find. So we had that before COVID, and we've been building that infrastructure. And then also in 2019, we had revised a collection development policy that had previously prohibited any spending of collections dollars on textbooks. I think that was a really common policy to say, we really have a limited budget. We just cannot buy textbooks with the collection dollars. But we revised that policy in 2019 and replaced that prohibition with a language that stressed that all students deserve to have access to their course materials, and that the high cost of textbooks is harmful to students and creates inequity. So those two things, the reserves, Legato services with our reading lists, and the fact that we shifted that collection development policy to say we're intentionally now going to be investing our collections dollars in reading materials that are directly tied to curriculum, really set us up to have all this infrastructure ready once COVID did hit, for faculty who were looking for ways to, provide resources to students that were easy to get to, that, they kind of knew how to find, that they knew they were going to get support with. We were ready to go with that to make that argument. So, and we knew that when campus physically closed, students really struggled with not having access to that physical reserves desk. And we're able to kind of translate that into when we work with faculty on identifying resources for their course, that, these textbooks really do, the high cost of them. You may not always realize it, or you may not have realized it in the past, but students really weren't buying them. And in the age of COVID, when we don't have a physical reserves desk, it's really obvious to see how much that cost of textbooks impacts students' ability to complete their coursework.
Exactly. Excellent. Okay, so Sarah, you mentioned in a previous conversation that you've been involved in discussions about policy enforcement throughout the library. I'm wondering if you could talk about how you're maintaining, the best you can, consistency in your approach. How are you equipping your staff with the tools that they need to enforce patron compliance, and how are you managing the various ways staff feel like they need to approach these situations?
Sure. So this is a hot topic. We spend a lot of time talking about it in our library. And just for context for your listeners, the university has a mask requirement and a social distancing requirement that's in effect in every university building, except residence halls, which are kind of its own set of rules. But all classroom buildings and all, the library, office buildings, et cetera, folks are required to wear a mask. And, we get varying degrees of compliance. Almost everyone has a mask when they show up, so that's great. And if they don't, we do have masks available at the desk in individually wrapped envelopes that we can pass to them. And some folks just genuinely like forgot or whatever. But as I'm sure you can imagine, there are others who, just don't want to wear one.
Right.
And then there's varying degrees of what how people choose to wear the mask. And I think you all know what I'm talking about. Like, is it completely covering the nose, or
Yeah.
is it hanging off the chin? That sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So at any rate, within the university-wide guidance on this, our dean and library administration has been helping us to take a library-wide approach where all employees are responsible for enforcement. It tends to fall pretty heavily to my department because we are the ones who are present and interacting with folks day to day.
Mm-hmm.
We also are the ones that are here weekends, late at night, when, as I'm sure everyone who's worked in a library knows, there tends to be more shenanigans than during the day. But anyway, in terms of equipping our faculty and staff to deal with this, I really think that it's through conversation.
Right.
It regularly comes up during any meeting that involves more than just a handful of folks, and it's frequently in trying to navigate, well, which rule do I enforce and how do I enforce it, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So to that end, our admin office, in consultation with managers around the library, created a kit. And this kit is actually in one of those construction clipboards that are like hollow on the inside and they're basically a box that you can place things in.
Mm-hmm.
And in that box, we have a standard set of talking points, a tracking sheet for compliance issues, and that's really just so we can have a sense of like how bad is it?
Right. Yeah.
We aren't like taking names or anything like that, but just hash marks. We also have individually wrapped masks, straws, because as some folks may be aware, but I was just having a drink is a common excuse for not having your mask on.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have handouts about university and library policy. And by the way, I cannot take credit for any of that. That like I said, was largely driven through our library administration office, but it's been very handy to have, and it gives us all a starting point for going through the library and ensuring compliance.
Right.
And in terms of like the actual walkthroughs, we've got a two-pronged approach. We have our student assistants going on hourly walkthroughs throughout the building. And while we do not expect them to talk to patrons about compliance issues, we do encourage them to make note of it so that when they get back, they can tell us if there's a group without masks on, we can go and address it.
Mm-hmm.
And then on our staff walkthroughs, those are primarily about compliance, whereas the student ones have some other elements to them. And with the staff, we have taken the approach that this is an opportunity to connect with students, which I know sounds really weird because we're just talking about compliance and that's never fun. But kind of taking that framing with us when we go out and approaching students, even if they're doing great.
Yeah.
They're fine, they're masked, they're socially distanced. Even just approaching them and saying, "Hey, I hope you're having a great day. Let us know if there's anything you can need help with."
Mm-hmm.
That takes some of the edge off of like, oh, there's a library staff member walking by, and they all know us because they see that clipboard. And then it also makes it a little easier when you do have to speak with someone, like you've already made a connection, or another library staff member has already made a connection with them that was positive.
Right.
So that's been our approach. Compliance has ebbed and flowed.
Mm-hmm.
At the very start of the semester, it was a little bit of the Wild West while everyone was learning the rules. Then we settled into a routine. It was really impressive how well everyone was doing. And then midterms happened. And, I guess with the stress and coffee, everyone just lost their minds.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of been our experience so far.
Okay. Excellent. So Lauren, you shifted pretty aggressively into a patron-driven acquisition process, and essentially whatever students and faculty were requesting, you ordered it. You also hit the pause button temporarily on interlibrary loan, borrowing and lending while employees were not permitted to work on campus. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you managed all of that. It really sounds like you put collection spending into high gear at that time.
Yeah. So in some ways, COVID did allow us to simplify the user experience a little bit. And I really loved what Sarah said about the four S's, that if you can't keep it the same, make it simple, at least in that first two S's there. Because,
Right.
that is, I think that's kind of guided us a little bit in terms of if we're going to change things up, how can we simplify them for the user, even if things actually end up more complicated for us on the back end. What we did, we turned off our physical, our CSU resource sharing network, CSU Plus, was sort of an unmediated network where the user could go into our catalog and place a request for something, and that would initiate a process of filling that physical material without us, like our staff at San Marcos, really doing anything. It would just go out to the other campuses to fill that order, right? And that's kind of how the network worked in an unmediated way. So we turned that button off, but we kept the ILL button on and routed
Okay.
all requests for anything that we did not have through ILL. And I think, that it did end up working pretty well. I mean, it was a ton of work, obviously, on the manual side. And that's the piece that we're right now trying to operationalize to try to make that a little bit less work and less manual. But really, because any book request is going to be something that we had to buy digitally. That's how we then routed all of that stuff to acquisitions.
Hmm.
And then we're setting up now, because we were doing that over email. And as you can imagine, that has become very unwieldy as demand has just continued. It never stopped in a way that typically over the summer, at least, there's usually a slowdown in usage while summer classes are going on. There's just not as much volume, right, of classes.
Yeah.
We never saw that slow down between March and now, just users requesting materials. And I'm not really sure how to explain that, except that we know faculty were ordering a lot of things over the summer and doing a lot of work on their course design over the summer that,
Hmm.
they wouldn't normally have, or maybe they would have just, had not have to do it so intensively or so dramatically, to change the materials that they were using. So we just saw so much demand this whole time, basically. And then I think, we recognize that a book that one student needs or requests is often one that more users would find useful. So we usually have been buying those permissive licenses, DRM free, wherever we can. The
Yeah.
workload for processing all of those requests and the ebooks for reserves has completely consumed that, acquisitions and metadata daily work. And that's really primarily what we've been focusing on. And we absolutely have been able, we've spent a lot of funds on that, and we've been able to do that because campus, again, recognized that and told us that we would be able to be supported financially in doing that.
Hmm.
But that is all that we are doing. We are not collecting anything for library collections that is not directly tied to a user request, whether it's for reserves or one of those ILL digital on demand requests. So that is, we are spending a lot of money in collections, but it's only
Yep.
on things that users are requesting.
Right. And sort of when we last spoke, you had this interesting story that, sort of out of necessity, any nervousness you might have had about fulfilling those requests went away. But in the meantime, you were, you and your staff were kind of surprised about the kinds of requests you were getting, particularly from the students. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Right. So historically, there's always been this trepidation about letting patron driven acquisition um, be too patron driven, I guess, if I
Yeah.
put it that way. Like that there needs to be some like librarian guidance in what users are able to buy. And so we've mitigated that in the past by doing evidence-based acquisitions programs where, we've basically worked with a publisher, like Elsevier, Springer, Taylor and Francis to develop a uh, evidence-based package that then users can use, and then we buy from that, right? And that's
Hmm.
had this kind of like librarians are sort of guiding these collections in some ways. But since we've gone just request whatever, the request button is in the catalog, and request away basically. And we expected, in some ways, I expected like, oh, there's going to be things that people request that we'll have to evaluate and think maybe we don't really want this, or maybe it's too old to add to the collection, or for whatever reason, it's not something that we actually want to spend our money on. And we have not seen
Right.
that. There has been almost nothing that a student has requested that I haven't, as I'm filling the order said, we absolutely need this book in the collection. I'm amazed we didn't already have it. And so student collection development has been really outstanding. And before the pandemic, we had, this identified need that we had a lot of gaps in the collection in terms of representation and inclusion. We didn't have a collection. We still really don't. We need to do better in this regard, just in a continuing way, but to reflect the diversity of our student body, to reflect a variety of lived experiences. This is something that
Right.
we, have been intentional about doing and making moves in order to be more intentional about that. And students have really stepped in with what they're requesting and what they're researching, and shown that students are very good at identifying resources that are going to reflect their lived experiences. They're going to reflect, identities. And I think that's been really wonderful, is to be able to, and it aligns really well with how at Cal State San Marcos we see students as scholars, that their inquiry is legitimate academic scholarship, and that, being respectful of their knowledge and their lived experiences and what they bring to the table in their research is what really kind of leads to those transformative learning experiences. So, I think it's been a really positive experience to open that up, and then to look back at everything the students are requesting, that by and large, it's far more advanced than, even some undergraduate things. I know that we know that undergraduates are requesting them, but the things like academic anthologies and really advanced just readings in general, but students are requesting them, and it's because they align with their research, and it's because I think by and large students are very good at knowing that something in that they find through our catalog is going to be relevant. It's all been recent stuff, so yeah, I think that that's been really wonderful to see our students requesting things in that way, and it's certainly made our collection a lot better because we've opened that up in that way.
Great. Excellent. That's wonderful. You just heard from Sarah Shippey Copeland and Lauren Magnuson. Sarah is Director of Desks and Patron Experience at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and Lauren is Head of Collections, Delivery, and Access at California State University, San Marcos. This episode was sponsored by Taylor and Francis. Join us next week when we talk about the elements of their plan that worked really well, and for those that didn't, how they adjusted on the fly.
Like with a set of smart lockers, they would typically have a workflow kind of built in, right? And we had to build that out for a manual process. And we started with that as the default for all items that students or faculty or whomever checked out. And we got a couple weeks in when we realized that it was really cumbersome, and patrons seemed pretty indifferent to it. And the question came up from one of the staff in my department, hey, could we make this optional?
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.